fellow humans, and welcome to another episode of the Tiger Den podcast with your host, Kyle Tiger Jarvis. And I wish I could say that I'm excited for this episode, but I'm not. However, it does need to get done. Today's episode is going to be different. It's going to be personal for me, and I'm going to do my best to get through it. But it's a topic that's always been important to me and has become more important to me than I ever could have imagined. So I'm going to do my best to get through this. And I thank you all for being here with me and for following the show. And there's so much to cover on this topic regarding police reform. So I'm going to do my best to tackle different aspects of this whole situation. It's very complicated. There's a lot of different parts to it. And so I'm going to do my best to break down what I think are the most important parts of it. And then I'll get into my story about how this particular topic has come to completely change my life. So, without any further delay, let's start talking about policing in this country, where we are, where it goes from here, and what needs to happen. So I'd like to start a little bit by talking about just how ingrained policing has become, to the extent that it has saddled so many millions of Americans with criminal records. The numbers on that are kind of staggering, actually. Today, nearly 1/3 of the working adult population in America has a criminal record. Nearly half of black males and about 40% of white males are arrested by the age of 23. If all arrested Americans were citizens of a nation, it would be the 18th largest nation in the world. And that's out of 196 officially recognized nations in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about conviction rates as it relates to this, because one of the contributing factors to this systemic issue, whereby we have so many citizens with criminal records, is part of this juggernaut as it is. It's a very large animal when you think about it. So you have politicians who are lawmakers, and they make laws in theory. Lobbying aside, that's for another time. But in theory, Congress people make laws, and then police are tasked with enforcing those laws. And then you have, of course, the court system, which litigates those accusations and allegations in so many ways, whether it's criminal or civil or whatever the case may be. And then you have, of course, jails and prisons, probation officers, parole officers. You got to have the administrative staff for those places, as well as the courts, and then bailiffs, the attorneys, both private and public. I work in this system as an investigator for the Public Defender's Office, so I have an inside track on just how large this animal is in terms of what it is and how it's meant to operate. And essentially, it is meant to extort the general public for money and for labor in some cases, where you're ordered to do community service, or perhaps you get sentenced to some time in jail or, God forbid, in prison, and you can then be basically put into servitude. For those of you who've seen the excellent documentary flick on Netflix called 13th, about the 13th Amendment, and how it's essentially slavery under a different name. So this is a very specific organism in and of itself that is designed to control people. And as you'll see, as we progress through some of the facts here, it'll start to become more and more clear that it's not about serving and protecting you or me or our neighbors. So the conviction rates in this country for the average citizen are pretty staggering. And so let's get into that a little bit. In the U.S. federal court system, the conviction rate rose from approximately 75% to approximately 85% between 1972 and 1992. So over a 20-year period, the federal court conviction rate jumped about 10%. And that's quite a jump. For 2012, the U.S. Department of Justice reported a 93% conviction rate. In 2000, the conviction rate was also high in the U.S. state courts, because those are just federal numbers that I've given so far. Only 2% of federal court defendants even saw their cases go to trial. 2% in federal courts. Overall, the conviction rate in both state and federal courts is about 90% that end in a conviction at trial or in a plea deal. 90%. So if you end up getting charged with something, it's really hard to beat the rap. And guilty or innocent is not the only factor, as privileged people might expect that it is. But it isn't. So, to get into some of these numbers again, in 2018, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reported that among defendants charged with a felony, 68% were convicted. And with felony conviction rates highest for defendants originally charged with a motor vehicle theft at 74%, driving related offenses, murder, burglary, those all had high conviction rates, etc. But overall, and this has been said many times, the U.S. is by far the world's leader in incarceration, with over 2 million people in prison, which is a 500% increase over the last 40 years. Changes in sentencing laws and policy, and not changes in crime rates, explains most of this increase. And I think this all comes from Pew Research, but it cites the source on that anyway. I believe it was the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So in 40 years, the prison population has gone up 500%, and we now incarcerate more people than any other country on earth at about 2 million people. And again, this speaks to the juggernaut, the machine. It's a machine that they have to feed because they have to justify it. And I meant to look this up earlier and I forgot to, so forgive me, but there was a time recently, I don't know if this is still the case, where prison building and building of jails and prisons was the #1 fastest growing construction sector in America. And this was only a few years ago that I knew this to be the case. So, again, I don't know if that's still currently true, but either way, it speaks to the veracity, the just how ingrained this entire system has become in our daily lives, to the extent that a third of American adults have a criminal record. And of course we know how difficult it can be once you have a criminal record to pursue better things in life, even if that's your aim. It can be very difficult. You can take all the right steps afterwards and still have a stigma attached to you in certain contexts, whether it's getting a job or any other day-to-day aspect of life that requires you to, in an attempt to better yourself, and run up against something like this that can hold you back. And so now I want to talk a little bit in comparison to all this about police officers who commit crimes. And of course, this is only based on statistics that we have and officers who were actually arrested and charged. So it's saying a very different thing than the number of officers, police officers, that actually commit crimes. Because as I'm sure you can imagine, they get away with all sorts of crimes of all natures. But when it comes to actual arrests and charges, the numbers are pretty interesting on this as well. So I want to talk a little bit about this. Police officers are arrested about 1,100 times a year, which is about 3 times a day. About 72% of officers charged in cases with known outcomes are convicted. So that's about 20%, 20 to 21% less than the conviction rate, at least at the federal level, and roughly at the state level, called about 18% lower than the state court level, than that of citizens like you and I. More than 40% of those crimes are committed on duty, and nearly 95% of the officers charged are men. No big surprise there. 22% of police arrested were previously named in a federal civil rights lawsuit at some point during their careers. So think about that. Of all these officers that end up getting arrested and charged with a crime, 22% of them, so over 1/5, were previously named in a federal civil rights lawsuit at some point in their careers prior to that. Makes you question whether they maybe should have still been on the job at that point when they got arrested. And so we have, I believe some of this information I'm citing came from 538, as well as the Justice Department statistics. And so they talked to this guy, I got his last name Stinson, and I don't know if I ended up getting his first name, but he's a professor, I believe, somewhere that studies these kinds of statistics. At any rate, his comment on this was, police crimes are not uncommon. Our data directly contradicts some of the prevailing assumptions and the proposition that only a small group of rotten apples perpetrate the vast majority of police crime. So in other words, it's prevalent enough that the few rotten apples theory is just out the window. Although nearly 60% of the crimes occurred when the officer was technically off duty, Stinson wrote, a significant portion of these so-called off-duty crimes also lies within the context of police work and the perpetrator's role as a police officer, including instances where off-duty officers flash a badge, an official weapon, or otherwise use their power, authority, and the respect afforded to them as a means to commit that crime. And so, you know, I think that's pretty clear. You know, what he's saying is the data shows that there's really no difference in terms of the way police commit crimes compared to that of the general public. It's just how it's handled that's different. And I think that's ultimately the point. The conviction rates are lower for police. They're often not even charged because they're afforded special protections. And I think one of the main points when it comes to reaching common ground, because this is obviously a very divisive, explosive topic for a lot of people. And I think one of the things that we have to be able to come together on is that being a police officer is absolutely an important and dangerous and demanding job. There's no argument there. But if we're going to afford it the respect that the pro-police faction in this country wants us to, then we need to start asking more of our officers in terms of how they conduct themselves. And when they fail to conduct themselves in a way that would get you or I arrested and more likely than not, 90% chance, convicted and saddled with a criminal record, that they not only be held to those same standards that we would, but possibly even stricter standards because of what it is that they do, who it is that they're supposed to be, and what it is that they're supposed to mean to society. And instead we have it backwards. We give them added protection. We give them more leeway when they fuck up. But me or you are almost certainly fucked if we get arrested for anything. 90% chance that we're going to get convicted. So that's a main point, I think, as a society that we're going to have to take a hard look at and hopefully be able to come to some kind of agreement on. Because I think it's really important that we do try to reach common ground and try to agree on a set of stipulations and we have to decide what it is we want policing to be. And what we have right now is a disaster zone. And just to drive this point home a little bit more, I want to talk a little bit about domestic violence rates among the ranks of police officers and how this compares to the general public. So another aspect of this that I want to get into is, as it relates to police who commit crimes themselves, is domestic violence and the rates of domestic violence among the ranks of police. And this is really important because, as I said, I work in the justice system for the Public Defender's Office. I'm an investigator and I work cases of all kinds for the Public Defender's Office. And a lot of those cases are domestic violence cases. It's a huge percentage of what it is that I do that involves some kind of domestic situation. So when we talk about police who are arresting other people for this very thing, and these people are being prosecuted by the courts and convicted at least 90% of the time, I think we need to shed some light on what happens at home with police officers and their families. Several studies have found that romantic partners of police officers suffer domestic abuse at rates significantly higher than the general population. And while all partner abuse is unacceptable, it is especially problematic when domestic abusers are literally the people that battered and abused women are supposed to call for help. As the National Center for Women and Policing noted in a heavily footnoted information sheet, 2 studies have found that at least 40% of police officer families experience domestic violence, in contrast to 10% of families in the general population. So 40% versus 10%. A third study of older and more experienced officers found a rate of 24%, indicating that domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more common among police families than American families in general. So the low end figure was 24%, and still that's compared to 10% within the general population. And so another aspect of this is that cops typically handle the cases of police family violence informally, often without an official report, investigation, or even a check of the victim's safety. This is all according to the summary, the data summary that was mentioned, the report. This informal method is often in direct contradiction to legislative mandates and departmental policies regarding the appropriate response to domestic violence crimes. So in other words, they're not following protocol when they do that, and they usually do it that way. But part of the problem here is that police are not held accountable to essentially anyone except for the municipal officials that hire them. But they're so embedded in the justice system and the judicial system, and as we've talked about, it becomes this very, very large animal. And so you have this problem where, you know, they're handling it informally. Even officers who are found guilty of domestic violence are unlikely to be fired, arrested, or referred for prosecution. Think about that. They're unlikely to be fired. Among those charged, arrested, and convicted, more than half of them kept their jobs. And that's at much higher rates than those who were charged and convicted of theft or drug use. And a lot of that last bit came from an article in the Atlantic. So that's a lot to chew on. But again, I think we have to come to some very real collective realization in this country, and we have to acknowledge the parts that make us uncomfortable. And I know that a lot of this makes a lot of you uncomfortable because you respect police. You might have a police officer in your family, somebody who's close to you that you love very much and who you believe is a good person. And they may very well be. But the culture of policing in this country is broken. And there is stat after stat to drive it home. And I'm just giving you a taste. And I think if we're going to reach agreements, and if we're going to get to common ground, then this is another specific, concrete example that we need to be able to point to and say, this is not okay. This needs to be rectified. We cannot have cops being arrested, charged, and convicted for domestic violence and then keeping their jobs. That's unacceptable. Because now you're saying that you're going to put them back out on the street and go arrest their neighbor for the same thing that they were arrested for, but they got to keep their job, but their neighbor might not be so lucky. Not to mention that their neighbor has a higher chance of getting convicted in the first place. And so we have to start talking about these things together as citizens, as a society, and we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we want out of this? What's right and what's wrong? What's going to work for us all together as a society for this whole thing to work? Because right now I think we can agree that it's not working. And so here's something concrete right here. Domestic violence among police and the way that it's handled. We need to change that. And so, of course, when we talk about police reform, one of the biggest aspects of that is the fact that police kill a very high number of people, a disturbing number of people each year. It's around 1,000, 1,100, 1,200. And you know, to some people that might not sound like a lot, but that is a lot. That's 3 or 4 people every day that are killed interacting with police. And I'm not going to get into specific examples. Well, I am going to get into one specific example later on, but I'm not going to get into any well-known cases at this point. I don't think that that's helpful for this particular conversation. We could potentially do that another time. But for now, I just want to focus on some hard numbers and some of the implications of those numbers, because there's plenty to dig into with just this information here. So, this year, 2021, and this was as of about a week ago, police have killed 429 people. And in fact, there have only been 6 days at the time that I put this together, which again was about a week ago. There have only been 6 days this year where police have not killed someone. Most killings by police begin with traffic stops. That's 118 of the 429. Or mental health checks. That's 123 of the 429. Or domestic disturbance responses. 141 of the 429. Or reports of low-level or non-violent offenses, 229. levels of violent crime in cities do not determine the levels of police violence. And they cited one specific example of Buffalo, the city of Buffalo versus the city of Orlando. And I was a little surprised at this because last year the Buffalo Police Department did not come across so well in some of the police protest situations. I think that's where the elderly man with the cane got pushed back and his head cracked open. But I could be wrong about that. I have to double check. But either way, the point that they made was that Buffalo and Orlando are roughly the same size and population, roughly the same demographics, a lot of similarities between the two cities, and yet the number of police killings, I can't remember, it was Orlando's was off the charts, and Buffalo only had, I think, a couple over the same time frame. So there are ways, clearly, to avoid killing people, and we have to be able to look at the places where they're able to police without killing and try to spread that process, that approach, throughout other departments. But of course, that's just a very small step, and I'll get into specific steps at the end that I believe we can take to create legitimate change in policing in this country. So 98.3%, so the vast majority of killings by police from 2013 to 2020 have not resulted in a crime being charged. So only, less than 2% of the time does a police officer get charged for killing someone over an 7-8 year period. And if you break down almost any of those situations, the logistics of how the incident unfolded, you could be certain that in almost every situation, you or I would have been charged with a crime, whether it was murder, manslaughter, something. In 2020, police killed 1,127 people, resulting in only 16, or 1%, being charged with a crime. 16 police officers out of 1,127 killings. About 1% were charged with a crime. Of the 1,127 killings by police in 2020, officers were identified in 444. So less than half. We don't even know. We know the officer. More than half, we don't. They weren't identified. Of the 444 that were identified, at least 14 had shot or killed someone before, and 5 had multiple prior shootings. Of the 1,127 killed by police, 97 involved reports of a subject behaving erratically or having a mental health crisis. Of the 1,127, 670 were reported to have had a gun, 180 a knife or a sharp object, 65 were in a vehicle, 59 had an other object, 73 were undetermined, and 80 were unarmed. And then I added this point here, in comparison to other countries. In many countries, police routinely disarm people who have knives without shooting them. For example, police in the United Kingdom encounter knife attacks at a similar rate as U.S. police, but handled these situations without using firearms in all but 3 cases in 2020. and it doesn't say out of how many cases that was, but it does say that knife attacks happen at about the same rate. That police are involved with those incidents at about the same rate as police here in the U.S. So it seems like a pretty fair comparison in that regard. Consistent with international law, police in the UK are prohibited from using firearms except where strictly necessary after considering non-violent and less lethal options. Laws in most U.S. states do not require police to exhaust all available alternatives prior to using deadly force. Of the 670 killed who were armed with a gun, a sixth of those were not threatening anyone at the time, meaning de-escalation was possible. And then of the 80 people who were unarmed at the time that they were killed by police, 49 of them were people of color. Black people were more likely to be killed by police, less likely to be armed, and more likely to have not been threatening someone at the time of the killing. And all this came from the police violence report on mapping police violence. So, again, this raises, some very real questions about where we want to go in this country with policing and how it is that we think these situations should be handled. And it's hard to think that if police in the United Kingdom, and another country I was looking at was Japan, where they have a lot of similar interactions with police, but a lot less police killings. We need to ask ourselves why it is that we don't focus more energy on that, because we certainly have the capability, the budgets, the manpower to train police officers how to de-escalate situations, especially where it involves somebody who's not threatening someone already, or someone who's in a mental health crisis. So, and of course the other aspect of this is non-lethal means. There's tasers, there's beanbag, rubber bullets, and in other developed countries they use these tools a lot and successfully, and it allows them to avoid killing citizens. And for some reason in this country we just haven't decided to hold not just our police officers, but ourselves as a society accountable for this. It seems inhumane. And I don't know how we got here, but it's reached such a point where, we have people who say, well, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, or just comply and you won't die, And I feel like we need to have a very real conversation about, being a criminal or an alleged criminal doesn't mean that you should be marked for death. And, obviously there's always going to be exceptions. If somebody is actively threatening an officer or a fellow citizen, of course, appropriate action should be taken. And, you can get into the worst of crimes. If as a police officer you witness somebody do something heinous to somebody else, I'm not gonna sit here and support an extrajudicial killing in that context. I don't think, we need police officers to be, judge, jury, and executioner in that situation. It's something different, though, than what we're talking about. What we're talking about is police who open fire in just completely unacceptable circumstances, with other people around, without regard for what could happen. And of course, part of the reason for that is that we don't hold them accountable the way that we need to in order to create real change. And I think we need to come to an agreement first that change is necessary. So another thing that I want to get into here involves, now that we've sort of covered how often police kill people, there's another layer to this, which is dogs that are killed by police. And it's gotten so bad that Laurel Matthews, a supervisory program specialist with the Department of Justice's Community-Oriented Policing Services, and the acronym for that is DOJ COPS. So she works for their office, Laurel Matthews, and she called fatal police versus dog encounters an epidemic, quote unquote. So that's a DOJ official calling it an epidemic. And at the time that she said that, I think this was a couple of years ago, she estimated that 25 to 30 pet dogs are killed each day by law enforcement officers, equaling roughly between 9,125 and 10,950 dogs each year. And there are other independent sources that put that number much higher, at as much as 30,000 per year, dogs who are killed by police officers. And so, as a dog owner and animal lover, that's something that really strikes a chord with me. I can only imagine how I would feel in a situation like that, and I do know what many of these situations are like, because many of them are captured on video, whether it's by the officer's own body camera or by a citizen's own surveillance camera or some kind of business surveillance footage nearby. A lot of these incidents are caught on video, and I wish I could say that I haven't watched as many of them as I have, but I have watched a lot. There's actually a Facebook page called Dogs Shot by Police, and there's a page that you can follow, a website online called Puppyside that tracks these incidents. And it's gotten so bad that there's a study that showed that half of all shots fired by police are directed at dogs. And in LA specifically, it's become a pretty big problem. 1 out of every 4 times that LA police officers intentionally fired their guns during the last 20 years, the target was not a man, it was man's best friend. Though the killing of a pit bull by an officer 3 weeks ago sparked anger among animal rights activists, LAPD data shows that shooting incidents involving dogs are commonplace. Since 1985, police have shot at more than 465 dogs, killing at least 200 and wounding at least 140. according to incident reports. That's just actual reports that were filed. Um, and that's another issue, is that in most cases there's no requirement that departments track these incidents, and so we do not have complete numbers on really important situations like this. So so the dog thing has gotten just completely out of control, and I think a lot of this came from the LA Times. The LA Sheriff's Department, though smaller than the LA Police Department, has shot at more animals over the last decade. And though the LAPD officers have shot at an average of almost 26 dogs a year in that period, sheriff's deputies have fired at an average of 36 animals a year, almost all of them dogs. The Puppycide database shows that, there's a story of a small town Maryland mayor who was mistakenly targeted for a drug raid, during which his 2 black labs were shot and killed. One was shot 4 times. The other one was shot twice, including once as she ran away. And this was a mayor. And I think it was a police chief from Seattle from 1994 to 2000. He also served 28 years in the San Diego Police Department. His name is Norm Stamper. And he was quoted, I think this is from a Daily Beast article, he said, "I think all of this drug war imagery has produced a mentality that didn't used to exist. It's, I'm part of a war, I have a mission, and nothing is going to get in the way of me completing that mission. You're kicking down doors, barging in with guns, and when animals do what animals do, they become collateral damage. Too many officers have gotten rather callous about it, I'm afraid." And the mayor in Maryland, the raid on his home was actually the second in 10 months in which police in Prince George's County burst into a private home during a drug raid and shot and killed the family dog, and then realized they had raided the wrong house. So twice in 10 months in the same county that happened. They raided the wrong house and killed the family dog, or dogs, in the mayor's case. National statistics on police-involved pet shootings are difficult to come by. Randall Lockwood of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals recently told the Las Vegas Review-Journal that he sees 250 to 300 incidents per year in media reports, and estimates another 1,000 that aren't reported. And that was from the Daily Beast. And so, again, we're faced with hard questions about why are police killing so many things, people, dogs, at alarming rates that should be alarming to all of us. And I think if we dig deep, we can find some very real reasons for that, and I'd like to get into that right now. There's a guy by the name of Dave Grossman, and he is a self-proclaimed expert and professor of killology. It's essentially a term that he invented. Although, ironically, he admits that he's never actually personally killed anyone, but I suppose that's besides the point. A little bit about Dave. He is a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army. After that, he founded the Killology Research Group. He's written books including On Killing, The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. He also wrote a book called Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, a call to action against TV, movie, and video game violence, which is so ridiculously absurd, and the fucking balls on this guy. He invented something called killology, and he's blaming video games and movies and TV for kids being violent. At any rate, Dave Grossman also speaks at civilian events on ways to reduce violence in society and deal with the aftermath of violent events such as school shootings. And he's also commonly used as an expert witness. But his real bread and butter is that he gives police seminars. And this is from a Men's Journal article. Much of Grossman's work draws on his study of killing in combat, specifically the psychological and physiological effects a person experiences upon taking a life. Since retiring from the Army 19 years ago, he has worked with hundreds of agencies, including the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the Secret Service, the Diplomatic Security Service, the U.S. Marshals, and U.S. Special Forces. But these days, Grossman's real bread and butter is local police. Over the last 2 years, he has spoken to more than 100 departments around the country. There's probably no one in America who trains more cops. There's almost certainly no one who trains cops who is better known. And so, I found an article from Slate from August 28th of last year. It was written by Justin Peters, where he got access to one of Grossman's training programs. And I want to just read a little bit from that. Grossman travels the country offering continuing education seminars to cops and cop adjacents. He musters scientific research, anecdotal evidence, and a boatload of presuppositions in order to prepare his students for the realities of combat, while valorizing the notion that the thin blue line is humanity's last bulwark against total societal collapse. Many have argued that the warrior cop-style training sessions teach law enforcement officers to start from a place of fear, which can lead them to quickly turn peaceful situations violent. And so, we're starting to unpack it. The thin blue line as humanity's last bulwark against total societal collapse, starting from a place of fear. Us against them. And they point to the example of Philando Castile, which is one of the more horrifying examples of a police killing. I've seen the video. If you haven't seen it, only you know if you have the stomach to be able to watch that sort of thing. It's highly unsettling, and it's hard to come away from watching it with any other conclusion but that he didn't have to die. And as they point out here in this Slate article, the officer who shot and killed Philando Castile during that 2016 traffic stop in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, had attended the Bulletproof Warrior course co-taught by Dave Grossman and his colleague Jim Glennon 2 years earlier. Over his career, according to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, that officer had clocked more than 100 hours of training on topics such as firearms usage, street survival, and use of force, but had only attended 2 hours of de-escalation training. So, we allow a guy like Dave Grossman to come in and train our local officers as if they were soldiers on the battlefields of Fallujah. And we wonder why they end up killing people when they don't have to, in most cases. Certainly in Philando Castile, certainly in many others that are too numerous to name. So I want to talk just a little bit more about this guy Grossman and his training style. And again, from this article, all from the same article. Grossman's America is a terrifying place where police are both the primary targets of and defenders against super predation. And if that term sounds familiar, it's probably because of the term super predator that we heard during the Clinton years. So increasingly, the police must face organized opponents armed with assault rifles and bombs, Grossman says at the onset of the class, citing an explosion in violent crime and an extraordinary rise in violence in the streets of America, although the stats show the exact opposite. That violent crime has been consistently on the downward trend for years. So, you know, a guy like Grossman comes in and fires cops up with this false imagery of war zones in the streets of America, and it's just not the case. You know, obviously there's always going to be exceptions. You have certain pockets of the country that might be, you know, pretty bad, but this notion that every police officer needs to have this mentality at all times is dangerous. There's more. Grossman wants cops to develop autopilot responses so that they will not be caught flat-footed when confronted with an armed suspect. Is it possible to see a gun pointed at you, draw your weapon, and shoot without conscious thought? Grossman asks. Not only is it possible, in this case it is highly desirable. Of course, his training must be state-of-the-art so that he knows instantly that the threat is indeed a gun and not a wallet or a cell phone. This is according to Grossman. That's what he says this state-of-the-art training is meant to do. In practice, many cops have had trouble clearing this threat assessment barrier. And then there's this heartbreaking quote from Philando Castile's girlfriend in the car, and she says, "You shot 4 bullets into him, sir. He was just getting his license and registration, sir." And so clearly that cop had a trouble clearing that threat assessment barrier. As a cop or a peacekeeper, your job is not to kill, it is to serve and protect. To do that, you may have to kill, Grossman says in Unit 4 of his training session. The most effective way to stop someone is to fire a bullet into his central nervous system. It is up to God and the paramedics as to whether the man dies. Your job is to stop the deadly threat, and the most effective way to do that is to make the threat die. And throughout the on-combat training, as this author of the article points out, Grossman is very, very clear that police officers must be ready to manifest the will to kill and to deal with the aftermath of having done so. And this is where it gets pretty disturbing if you're not disturbed already. Any natural or learned resistance to killing, any sense of the sanctity of human life, any human emotions, any remorse or compassion at the moment of truth can all be overcome and overwhelmed with training, Grossman says in Unit 2. What's more, he says, even a post-traumatic stress reaction can be averted with training. He acknowledges that killing in the line of duty can be very unsettling. That's one word for it. He presents a lot of material on how a cop might expect to feel after having done so, and how their colleagues and family can help them process and cope with the experience. Grossman does not deny the reality of PTSD, but he also argues that cops who kill need not be scarred for life by their actions. If you do the rationalization and acceptance ahead of time, if you prepare yourself and immerse yourself in the lore and spirit of mature warriors past and present, then the lawful, legitimate use of deadly force does not have to be a self-destructive or traumatic event, Grossman says. And so, if you're watching this based on, what we've talked about so far, about how this man's depictions of the average American neighborhoods and communities is highly inaccurate and incendiary in the context of training police. And I hope that that's something that we can look at honestly and agree that this is probably not a good idea. And yet this man trains hundreds of police departments across the country. And to me, it sounds like brainwashing. And convincing cops to kill without thinking or feeling that they should even have to ever worry about it. Because he gives them this prescription for how to deal with it, and tells them that they need to be able to deal with it because they're probably going to have to do it based on the threat that he's presenting. And I don't know about you, but I find that really disturbing. He's got them convinced that they're these righteous warriors. How does he say it? You prepare yourself and immerse yourself in the lore and spirit of mature warriors, past and present. Then the lawful, legitimate use of deadly force does not have to be a self-destructive or traumatic event. He's convincing them that they're these warriors in some larger battle of good and evil that's being played out on the streets of America. And it's just not true. So this is no doubt a big aspect of why we see police so quick to resort to violence in this country. And there's more evidence to explain why this happens. And that has to do with a special exchange program that police departments in states including Georgia, Florida, California, Arkansas, Michigan, Mississippi, Arizona, Tennessee, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., Texas, Utah, Virginia, the list goes on and on. And basically the way this program works is they do exchanges with American police and police forces and special forces from other countries, including China, Colombia, Egypt, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the original and primary focus of the program, Israel. Georgia in particular has taken advantage of this program. For 27 years, police departments in Georgia have received grants from the U.S. Department of Justice that subsidize these trainings. And since the program's inception in 1992, it has trained at least 1,700 participants, including officers from the Atlanta Police Department. Subsequently, police shootings in Georgia nearly doubled from 2017 to 2018. All of them, all of this is from a Progressive article, an article in the Progressive from October 7th, 2019. So that was the most recent data they had at the time. From the previous 2-year period, the shootings had doubled as they increased the amount of trainings that they sent their officers to on this exchange program. As several cities across the United States, is from the same article, became hotspots of unrest following the violent death of George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer, Amnesty International recalled Sunday that U.S. police trains in Israel alongside military officers who have, quote, racked up documented human rights violations for years. And, you know, you can say what you want about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm not going to get into that in this episode. That's for another time. But there is no denying that Israel has committed war crimes in their ongoing conflict with Palestine. And so, you know, it is what it is. You can argue back and forth about who's in the right, who's in the wrong. I'm not trying to suggest that, you know, nothing's ever been done to Israel. And again, I'm not going to get into that in this episode. But the fact of the matter is that you're talking about an extremely violent environment, and we're sending our police and then bringing theirs over here to train with our officers. And there's some disturbing results. And especially when you consider some of the implications of Israel. When the U.S. Department of Justice published a report on August 10th that documented widespread constitutional violations, discriminatory enforcement, and a culture of retaliation within the Baltimore Police Department, there was rightly a general reaction of outrage. And Baltimore is notorious for being one of the more corrupt police departments in the country. They've been caught planting evidence on totally innocent people. There's a litany of terrible things that Baltimore PD has been caught doing in the past. And so when they came out with this report exposing a lot of this, the point that they're making here in this article is that what didn't receive much attention is that the Baltimore police received training on crowd control, use of force, and surveillance from Israel's national police, military, and intelligence services. Amnesty International, other human rights organizations, and even the U.S. Department of State have cited Israeli policy and police for carrying out extrajudicial executions and other unlawful killings, as well as using ill treatment and torture even against children, and suppression of freedom of expression and association, including through the government surveillance and excessive use of force against peaceful protesters. And it goes on to give various examples of the disturbing ways in which Israeli police and special forces operate in their own country. And you have to look at the way the protests against police brutality unfolded last year. And, you know, it's a hot button topic, but the fact of it is that, you know, people got together and did what we're told we're supposed to do. We're told that if you want change, that you're supposed to make your voice heard, but to do so in a civil way. So there were many, many people who did exactly that. They protested civilly, peacefully, and
They weren't out there to hurt anyone. And of course there were riots, and there were people with other motives, and that becomes tricky territory as well, because there was certainly a lot of evidence of outside agitators that were brought in to make things worse than they were, or maybe they would have been without that influence. But either way, even if you put the riots aside and look at just those who peacefully protested in hundreds of communities across the country. And we had peaceful protests near here where I live, in little old New Hampshire. And, in many cases, not here where I live, but in many cases in larger communities, those peaceful protests were met with police violence. The very thing that they were there protesting to begin with. And so it's hard not to think that at some point people are justified when they start burning shit to the ground. Because if we do the thing that you tell us we're supposed to do in order to achieve change, and we're making our voices as loud as they can be, and there's just case after case after case after case of just horrific examples of police violence and people getting killed and hurt when they didn't need to, and you react to that by doing the very thing that we're begging you not to do, then it's hard to come to any other conclusion than that we're doing it wrong. And so, again, whoever you are watching this, I beg you to consider these questions in the very core of your being, because it's as important as any issue that we have. There's a lot of problems in this country, and certainly I'll try to tackle some of those problems in episodes to come. But I can't think of a more pressing problem right now in this country than the issue with police violence. And so, to drive it home a little bit more, when we talk about the militarization of police, and certainly this is an issue that started years ago with regard to what was essentially surplus military equipment that the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, the Pentagon have been handing out like candy to local police departments. And we've got an article here from Jacobin magazine, and it talks about how loaded down with cast-off gear from the Pentagon, including body armor, bayonets, automatic rifles, grenade launchers, armored vehicles, and surveillance drones, police officers are more likely to regard peaceful protesters as enemy combatants, particularly when the Pentagon's own top official refers to their protest scenes as battle space. And I experienced this in a pretty direct way myself, as again, in a small community, even here where I live. In a former life, when I was a newspaper reporter for the Keene Sentinel, and a little town of Keene, their police department was given this thing called a Bearcat, and it's essentially an armored military type vehicle. And I ended up writing a bunch of stories about it because it was a hot button topic. There was a lot of questioning about, why do we need this in this community? Keene is a relatively quiet community. They have their
fair share of, crazy things that happen here and there, but for the most part, it's not the type of place that's, going to have an event that you need this kind of vehicle, this kind of equipment. But what I really want to get into with this goes beyond the equipment, and it gets into the personnel when it comes to the militarization of police, because as it turns out, 20% of American cops are ex-military. So 1/5 of all police in America are former military. Policing, in fact, is the third most common occupation for men and women who served in the military. And under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice provided local police departments with tens of millions of dollars to fund veterans-only positions. So they threw a bunch of money out there and said, use this money to hire a bunch of cops, but only cops who are former military. So, it's one of those things that I know sounds like a good idea to a lot of people. I know people who would probably say, oh, there's nobody I'd want more on my local police department looking out for me and my family than a former military man or woman. And, to some extent I understand that. I understand the instinct behind that. But at the same time, it creates problems. For example, the International Association of Chiefs of Police did its own report in 2009, which raised some concerns about the integration of military personnel into law enforcement in the wake of 9/11. According to this study, veterans returning from the Vietnam War could easily distinguish their combat environment, mostly jungle, farm, or open terrain, from their urban or suburban policing environment. But in the case of returning combat veterans from Iraq or Afghanistan, their combat environment and their policing environments may appear surprisingly similar. The report warned that past deployments in the Middle East, quote, may cause returning officers to mistakenly blur the lines between military combat situations and civilian crime situations, resulting in inappropriate decisions and actions, and particularly in the use of less lethal or lethal force. Co-sponsored by the DOJ's Bureau of Justice Assistance, the report also noted that combat veterans who suffer from PTSD and related depression, anger, withdrawal, and family issues may have a low tolerance for civilian complaints and a greater propensity for the use of inappropriate use of force. Some police chiefs interviewed reported that veterans under their command came back, quote, ill-prepared for the civilian world because their PTSD left them, quote, with exaggerated survival instincts. In Dallas, for example, more police shootings involved vets. More complaints of excessive force in Boston and Miami involved vets. And 1/3 of all Albuquerque police shootings were former vets involved over a 5-year period, including one officer who was sued after killing an unarmed motorist who was an Iraq veteran whose PTSD had caused him flashbacks, nightmares, and blackouts. Nevertheless, he was assigned to patrol a high crime area that was known as the war zone. So, we have guys like Dave Grossman training police to be ready to kill at the drop of a hat, and to do it like it's the flick of a switch, an instinct. And then we're doing exchange programs with countries like China and Israel and Kazakhstan, and training our police with their police and their special forces. And then we're taking veterans from the Middle East and putting them on the streets in the role of police officers, despite their PTSD issues. And once again, we come back to the place where we have to ask ourselves real questions. And that's the whole point of this. It's the whole point of me doing this, is to have conversations with you, with each other, about very real issues. And this is a very real issue. So, I want to talk a little bit about police suicide rates as well, because this has also become sort of an epidemic from what I understand. And I got this from some online sources. Police officers are at a higher risk of suicide than any other profession. In fact, suicide is so prevalent in the profession that the number of police officers who died by suicide is more than triple that of officers who were fatally injured in the line of duty. So think about that for a second. Of all police officers who die while they're employed as a police officer, 3 times as many are from suicide as those who are killed in the line of duty. That's a staggering number, and I think it says a lot. Researchers are attributing these statistics to the unique combination of easy access to deadly weapons, intense stress, and the human devastation that police are exposed to on a daily basis. And no doubt there's some of these other factors, especially if we have 20% of the police force that are veterans who've probably seen combat. The general population number for suicide is about 13 per 100,000. For cops, it's 17 per 100,000. The most affected states are California, New York, Florida, and Texas. I got all this from the Addiction Center online. It's a great online resource. And so, this notion of community awareness over police presence, and we talk about the mental health crisis a little bit too, but as a solution, mental health services, helping each other, finding ways to help people who are in need, rather than asking police to step in and do something that they're really not equipped to do, and probably shouldn't be. It's probably not part of their job, probably shouldn't be part of their job. And we need other people, professionals, who are paid well to do this. And so this notion of community awareness over police presence hopefully catches on with more and more people, because that's what we really mean when we say defund police. What we really mean is we need to take at least some of this money that we're giving to police budgets, incredible inflated budgets. Instead of doing that, let's take some of that money and divert it to mental health awareness, mental health services, drug treatment, all kinds of things that can help people who are broken and in need of help to build themselves back up so that they can become productive members of society, because ultimately isn't that what we all want, or what we should want? For each other, for each person. And if that's what it's really about, then that's what we should be doing. And so if we did that, it's going to benefit police in the long run too, because clearly they're also suffering under the weight of everything that's happening. And when we talk about the mental health crisis, it's staggering, and it's heartbreaking. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later in terms of how it recently affected me. Close to my life. But the other aspect of this that I think is worth mentioning is about police and what they're really for. So let's talk about how many crimes are solved by police. And this comes from Pew Research. Only about half of the violent crimes and a third of property crimes that occur in the United States each year are reported to police. And most of the crimes that are reported don't result in an arrest, a charging, or a prosecution of a suspect. And that's according to government stats. In 2015, the most recent year for which data was available, 47% of the violent crimes and 35% of the property crimes tracked by the Bureau of Justice Statistics were reported to police. These figures came from 90,000 households, which asked Americans ages 12 and older whether they were victims of a crime in the past 6 months, and if so, whether they reported that crime to law enforcement or not. And even when violent and property crimes are reported to police, they're often not solved, at least based on a measure known as the clearance rate. That's the share of cases each year that are closed or cleared through the arrest, charging, and referral of a suspect for prosecution. In 2015, 46% of the violent crimes and 19% of the property crimes reported to police in the U.S. were cleared, according to FBI data. So, they're not solving very many crimes. And I can tell you that based on my experience, that investigation is often at a premium when it comes to a lot of cases. Whether they don't have the time or the manpower, it's hard to say, but often investigation is not at the top of the priority list. And so more directly, when it comes to police and what they're here for, I want to talk about how most policing has little to do with real threats to public safety. The vast majority of arrests are for low-level offenses. Only 5% of all arrests are for serious violent offenses. So, most arrests do not involve anybody being threatened with anything in any way. The massive misdemeanor system in the United States is an important but overlooked contributor to overcriminalization and mass incarceration. For behaviors as benign as jaywalking, sitting on a sidewalk, or petty theft, an estimated 13 million misdemeanor charges sweep droves of Americans into the criminal justice system each year. And that's excluding civil violations and speeding. And while misdemeanor charges may sound like small potatoes, they can carry serious financial, personal, and social costs, especially for defendants, but also for broader society, which finances the enforcement of these minor violations, the processing of these court cases, and all of the unnecessary incarceration that comes with them. And that's from theprisonpolicy.org. Policing criminal law violations cost taxpayers $63 billion each year. There's some other numbers here. Policing costs the public in general 126.4 billion per year nationwide. And so really what I wanted to get to here is the case that involved the school shooting, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in Parkland, Florida. I'm sure you all remember that. It's one of the more horrific shootings that I think we've ever had in this country. And so after that, some of the students got together and filed a suit naming 6 defendants, which included Broward School District and the Broward Sheriff's Office, as well as School Deputy Scott Peterson and Campus Monitor Andrew Medina. And basically, their contention was that they were not properly protected by those entities and that they thought that they should have been. And what the U.S. Supreme Court eventually ruled was that neither the Constitution nor state law impose a general duty upon police officers or other government officials to protect individual persons from harm, even when they know the harm will occur, is essentially what their decision said. And what this law professor, Darren Hutchinson, from the University of Florida School of Law, is that police can essentially watch someone attack you and not intervene and not violate the Constitution or any supposed oath that they've taken to protect you or me or anyone else. Their duty is to suspect you of a crime and to arrest you for a crime and charge you with it and hopefully see you prosecuted for it. That's their duty. They have no obligation, legal or otherwise, to protect you. And I think that's something that most people, probably don't realize, because when we think of police, we think of serve and protect. And I think it's natural to think, yeah, of course, that's what police are. That's what they're for. They're going to protect me, and I can count on them for that. But the truth is that you can't. And that's not to say that there aren't cops out there who won't put their lives on the line. Surely there are some who will do that. But the law doesn't say that they have to. And there are many who don't, as we saw in this Parkland shooting case and a couple of others, where police did not intervene to save lives when they could have, and even hid behind civilians and their vehicles. So, there's a lot of aspects to this that need to be examined, and we need to think about what it is that we want out of police and what they're supposed to be, and then take a good hard look at what they are right now. And I think it's pretty hard to come to any other conclusion other than it's broken and it needs fixing. So another aspect of this that I want to get into, that's been talked about a lot, but I think is worth talking about a little bit here for this episode, is qualified immunity and what that means for police, where it came from. I'm not going to get super into it, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Qualified immunity was created in a series of Supreme Court decisions starting in the 1960s, which ruled that government employees cannot be held liable in federal civil court for violating someone's civil rights unless their conduct flew in the face of clearly established law. That, it turns out, is a high and often arbitrary bar to clear. As I reported last summer, and this is from a Mother Jones article. I didn't get the name of the author, but I can look it up for anyone that wants to find out afterwards. As I reported last summer, for the law to be considered clearly established, a judge must have previously found similar actions in a past case with nearly identical facts to be unlawful. In practice, this standard lets cops off the hook for blatantly illegal behavior simply due to lack of precedent. In one prominent example, a court had previously ruled that the Fourth Amendment prohibited unleashing a dog to attack a suspect who had surrendered by lying on the ground. But later, when other police officers were sued for setting a dog loose on a suspect sitting with his hands in the air, a judge still granted qualified immunity and dismissed the case. The law wasn't clearly established, according to that judge, because the suspect was sitting, not lying down. And so I was looking at another article from 538 on this topic, and they talked to a couple people. One of the points that they made in this 538 article is that it's very difficult to successfully sue a police officer for misconduct because the courts have granted them broad protections from legal liability for actions that they take on the job. This doctrine, qualified immunity, protects government officials from being sued if there isn't a violation of clearly established law, which means, in practical terms, that a case against a police officer will often be dismissed if the alleged behavior hasn't previously been found unconstitutional. And you can see the detail to which, judges and legal authorities will nitpick about whether or not precedent has been established. Well, precedent may be for someone who'd been lying down and attacked by a dog, but not necessarily someone who was sitting with their hands in the air. And so, as the 538 article here points out, this has resulted in a bizarre and circular trap for people trying to sue police for misconduct. To succeed, they need to find previous cases where similar misconduct occurred, but there are very few other precedents because other plaintiffs hit the same stumbling block. This is a big part of the reason that victims of police misconduct are very rarely compensated, and there is no predictable accountability for law enforcement officers who step out of line, said Jay Schweikart, a policy analyst with the Libertarian Cato Institute. His organization is one of many across the ideological spectrum that are currently urging the Supreme Court to reconsider the protections afforded to law enforcement professionals by this doctrine, qualified immunity. So, what we end up with here, and I'm going to wrap this up. I've been talking about a lot of different issues associated with this topic for a while now, and this is easily going to be my longest episode yet. But that's okay because it's an important topic, and I think all of these different issues are important to unpack individually as we get to the nitty-gritty of this topic. So I think, what we're left with here is a set of very real, very important, very pressing questions, difficult questions for some, but necessary questions nonetheless that need answers. I think there are answers already in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now and some of the solutions that I think we can implement that would go a long way towards repairing the broken system of policing in this country. First things first, mandatory de-escalation training for all police officers at least a few times a year. Okay, I don't know, you can settle on a number, but they have to have it at least a few times a year, and it has to be mandatory, and it has to be in-depth. De-escalation training. Cease all killology training. Dave Grossman and anyone like him, you gotta go. We can't have that in our local police departments. It's not suited for that. It's not a good fit. And it creates a bad energy before those police even step out the door for their shift that night. Cease all exchange programs with war crime states, Israel, etc. It's just, we have to be able to agree that it's just flat out inappropriate to send our officers to get trained by special forces in countries who've committed atrocities. And again, not to get into the political debate about that, that's another thing. But to have our police officers trained by Israeli troops and troops from Colombia or China or Kazakhstan or some of these other places with questionable situations of their own when it comes to policing and authoritarianism, it seems like a really bad fit. And civil asset forfeiture. That's a point that I didn't delve into. We can get into that another time. But that's, you can certainly feel free to look it up yourself. There's plenty of material on that topic. And it's frustrating, to say the least, once you figure out how it works and how much assets, as they're referred to, police end up confiscating under this this ability that that they're afforded. So that needs to end. Mandatory body cams for all police, period. If you are on duty as a police officer, you should be wearing a body cam, and you should have a dash cam as well. And as soon as an incident of any kind with a suspect begins to take place, it needs to be activated. No ifs, ands, or buts. All police, mandatory body cams, all the time. Period. It shouldn't be that difficult. We should all be able to agree on that, because if there's nothing to hide, and if the police officer is conducting themselves appropriately, then there should be no hesitation for all of us to be able to see that. So hopefully that's something that we can all agree on. And in that same vein, mandatory termination. I know that sounds extreme, but hear me out. Termination for any cop who intentionally disables their body cam or their dash cam for any reason once it's been activated. And the reason I say that, and the next thing plays into that as well, automatic charges against any cop who does so under obstruction of justice statutes. Because if you or I did the same thing, that's a little bit different, because as a civilian you don't have a body cam in a situation. But there have been situations where there have been civilian reporters, civilian journalists who document police activity, who have attempted to film police interactions, and they've been charged with obstruction of justice for, getting in the way or whatever it is that police are alleging that they did to interfere supposedly with their activities. So again, if there's nothing to hide, then it shouldn't even be a question as to whether or not they should have the body cams to begin with, that they should automatically be turned on when an incident begins, and that if they fuck with that body cam, they need to have consequences, serious consequences. End no-knock warrants as a common practice. I mean, I'd like to see it stopped altogether. I understand once in a great while you might have a situation where you're worried about a potentially dangerous suspect, and and the no-knock is the only way that you feel that you can keep your crew safe. So, open to the concept that once in a while this might need to be used, but it's used and abused by police in this country, and they get it wrong a lot. You can look it up. No-knock raid gone wrong. I gave you the example of the mayor in Maryland. It's just one of many. It has to end. Mandatory dog interaction training for police at least a few times a year. And again, this should be a no-brainer. Police should not be killing dogs to the tune of 20 a day. It's just unacceptable. And numbers that put it higher than that can't be confirmed. But estimates that say it could be as many as 30,000 dogs a year that are shot and killed by police on the job. Male people don't have this problem. Firemen don't have this problem. Fuel delivery people don't have this problem. The UPS guy doesn't have this problem. And so, if cops are going to continue to show that they do have this problem, then they need to take mandatory training to learn how to properly interact with dogs on the job so that they don't fucking kill them. And you could say, oh, well, dogs can get... Yeah, dogs can get scary. Yeah, a big dog can get scary. And sometimes it's a big dog that ends up getting shot because it got scary. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the hundreds and hundreds of dogs and the dozens of videos that I've personally watched that I wish I could say I haven't, where the dog was no threat or was of such a size that even if it had attacked, it's not saying much for you if you're a cop and you're scared of a dog that size. And I'm talking small dogs who have been shot and killed by police because they feared for their lives. End the military to police pipeline. It sounded like a good idea. It's not. And we talked about the reasons why. The transition is not healthy. Cease all DHS, Pentagon surplus weaponry and gear sharing programs. The militarization of police. They don't need tanks. They don't need automatic submachine guns. They don't need bayonets. They don't need grenade launchers. Okay? Local small town police departments definitely don't need any of this stuff. But when you give them stuff like this, at some point, it's almost like they feel that they need to use it eventually. And that's a bad recipe. Mandatory tracking of all police use of force incidents. And I say that because there is no mandatory record keeping. A lot of record keeping that's done on incidents of use of force and people who are killed by police are done by independent nonprofit agencies who rely on media reports and other sources of information, and then some statistics that are voluntarily provided by those police departments. Mandatory mental health checkups for officers at least a half dozen times a year. We talked about how suicide has become an epidemic in the ranks of police. And it needs to stop, and it needs attention. Just like mental health in the general population needs far, far more attention than it's getting right now, police need that same attention as well. And they're not getting it. Of course, It's not going to work unless we do all this other stuff as well, but that also has to be a part of it. Mandatory mental health checkups for all police officers multiple times a year. Some of these get a little tricky. I'd like to suggest an independent investigation panel for police shootings. And I think you could comprise a panel like that of professionals in the fields of mental health, psychology, human rights, constitutional law, and police training and protocols. So I don't know exactly how that would work, and I know it sounds kind of complicated, but anything's better than letting the police investigate themselves when they kill someone. Maybe it's justified, but maybe it's not. And if it's not, we've learned that they're not likely to admit that it's not. And so they cannot be trusted to investigate themselves. Who could in life? Most people could not. But for some reason, we afford police the ability to investigate themselves. That can't happen. We need some kind of outside entity to take care of that. Mandatory budget allocation for community outreach by police departments. And I know some police departments do that already, and that's great. But if they want the respect of the community and the community to trust them, then they need to involve themselves in the community in very real ways. So that needs to be something that happens automatically. Mandatory training on how to avoid racial profiling and bias. Everybody's got a little bit of racial profiling and bias tendencies within them. It's about being aware of those biases and tendencies and checking yourself, knowing how to recognize them. And so police officers especially, considering the importance and the stakes as to what it is that they do and the potential impact that it could have on the lives of those that they're aiming to potentially arrest. This is something that absolutely has to happen. They all need that training, regardless. Mandatory training on how to recognize the signs of a mental health crisis and how to de-escalate those incidents without resorting to violence. I can't speak to how important I think that part is, and another part to go along with that would be, especially in major metropolitan areas with large populations and large police departments, mental health professionals who are on staff, paid positions at the department, desks in the department, who are on call, someone on call at any given time to intervene in a mental health crisis instead of, or at the very least in addition to, sending police, but where this mental health professional or professionals, we send 2 at a time if we want. I'd gladly pay my tax dollars for that. To intervene, to try to avoid a violent outcome, which is so often the case. A constitutional amendment that solidifies an officer's sworn oath to protect and serve, and redefining custody to include any citizen in an emergency situation said officer is sworn to protect. So in other words, the students at the Parkland school or any other school in a situation like that. Any citizen that an officer encounters who is being threatened by another citizen, an imminent harm. A constitutional amendment that says that they actually have to serve and protect, unlike the Supreme Court's ruling, which we touched upon earlier, that says that they don't have to do that. That's where it stands right now. A police officer is not obligated to step in and help you. The only thing that they're obligated to do is to arrest someone afterwards if they think a crime was committed. That has to change. I think we also need a federal law that requires civil suit payouts by police departments in civil suits that they lose, that those payouts come from police pension funds or police commission funds and not from taxpayers. And I tell you what, I bet you'd start to see abuse of force start to dry up pretty quick if you did that, because if you start hitting them in the wallet where it hurts, that's when you start to see things change. Taxpayers should not be put on the hook when an officer beats the shit out of somebody or kills them. We shouldn't be paying for that when the city ends up paying out for that. That should come off their dime, out of their pockets. And frankly, this is another one of those things that I think we need to be able to agree on as reasonable citizens in this country. Would you accept that from any other person in any other profession, in any other situation? For that to be put on you? The doctor screws up somebody's surgery and that person dies, and they get sued, and they lose a medical malpractice suit. Should taxpayers be on the hook for that? Or should the hospital and the doctor themselves be on the hook for that? Mandatory domestic violence awareness training for police at least 4, 5, 6 times a year. You know, we talked about that earlier, and police are much more likely to be involved in domestic violence incidents themselves in their own homes with their own partners, far more likely than me or you. So clearly there's an issue there that needs to be addressed. And so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. It's a complicated topic, as I said. I hope you guys got something out of it, and of course I'm open to discussion. If anybody has comments, they want to discuss it further, you can talk about it in the comment section, or you can hit me up on my Facebook page. You can follow me there at the Tiger Den podcast, and on my YouTube channel as well. If you like this video, please give it a like on the YouTube, subscribe to the channel. Many more videos to come soon, but this is one that, as I said, is personal for me. And when I first sat down to do this episode, I expected to tell my personal side of this and how it recently affected my life in a very real way. But as I thought about it some more, and as I talked with somebody who means more to me than maybe anyone, and she reminded me that it's bigger than me, that this issue is bigger than me. And so I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the information speaks for itself. And I'd love to hear what you guys think. And I hope that if you think that this was a constructive, useful episode, that you'll share it with people that you love and care about. Spark some conversations with them. And hopefully we can find a way to make some of these changes together. And you know, I don't know exactly how we get there, but I know it starts with banding together to come to an agreement about what needs to be done, and then we can figure out exactly how to do it. But I can tell you it's going to start with trying to find some real political candidates who are willing
to take some serious action, because some of the candidates that you think you might be able to rely on, the political figures that you've been relying on to be against some of this stuff, are not. I'm not going to sit here and name names right now, but you have to pay attention. And if you're paying attention, you would see right now that the changes that we need are not happening, and they're not likely to happen under the current leadership. And so we need to do something about that as well. And so, I thank you all for being with me. And I'm sure I'll revisit this topic again soon. It's certainly lends itself to more than one episode. But I'm happy to get this episode out there. And again, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your opinions on this topic. And I hope that it sparks some real discussion with you, your family, your friends, and hopefully we can all get to a place where it's better for all of us. So until then, until next time, stay safe out there, take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you next time in the Tiger Den podcast.